Thanks very much, firstly. It was a very interesting talk. I think you're definitely right that we should pay more attention to these things from general philosophy of science. And in particular, I sympathize with this perspectival approach to neuroscientific modeling. I think it's a good approach. As I was reading your paper earlier in the week, one thought I had was why this is characterized in terms of intentional versus dynamical versus something more general like computational or mechanistic versus dynamical. And I think I understand why you've done that, but just to push this a little bit, I was thinking in terms of things a bit broader here, it might give you a tool for reconciliation or some kind of crossover at a higher level. So you said there's this crossover at a quantitative level, but there have been some attempts by some authors to synthesize mechanistic and dynamical approaches at kind of more qualitative levels. I know that you have your own concerns about the mechanistic approach to neuroscience, but putting that to one side for the moment, I wondered if you have had any thoughts on these attempts by people like Kaplan and Laya quite recently in Synthes.
Yeah. So I don't know what exactly to say about that. Yeah, I mean, I think, as philosophers of science, we can go in with it's nice when you can show that there's sort of explanatory unity. I think that's underlying these attempts to sort of reconcile these two perspectives, because there's this fear that if there's too much of splitting of each way of doing science, each lab almost has its own way of explaining things, then we're losing that big picture thing of like a unified notion of explanation, which someone like Campbell says it's only one kind of explanation, and then maybe only two, but then that's enough to cover all cases, and that's a really nice result. And in the case of sort of dynamical versus mechanistic things, so I can understand the motivation that you want to unify as much as you can, but at the same time, I do worry that it sort of misses the specific flavor of what's happening with dynamical models when you do that. So that's just my general impression. And so if you say that sort of mechanism is the bridge between the information processing and the dynamical systems one, it doesn't strike me as that true to the scientific practice, at least when you're looking at the modeling that is going on. So that's why I don't take that route.
Yeah, I mean, that seems fair, and I think all of these attempts have been very much from the mechanistic side. So I think one way of responding to this from a dynamical perspective would be to see it as them trying to reduce all of that to their models. And I think you're right, maybe that doesn't really capture exactly what's going on with the dynamical models there. On a similar line, I suppose, so the kind of noumenal or Kantian approach you propose, I think, is quite nice. But one thing I'm concerned about there is what we say about, so there has to be some kind of constraints. So there's some sense in which this underlying noumena constrains, or this kind of structure constrains our explanations, because it's not the case that just any perspective is valid. So yeah, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how we should think about those constraints imposed by the kind of inaccessible structures or something like that.
Yeah. So I would say, I'm saying at the end there that there aren't the mathematical structures of underlying the phenomena in any way that you would, like there's some kind of ontic realism, structural realism there. But I'm not denying that there's structure and regularity in nature, and that's what is constraining how we model things. So in another presentation I've been working on, I've been sort of thinking about the real patterns, that Zenit idea, and how people are using this now, like Angela Potocznik. She's saying that idealizations in science sort of capture a subset of the causal real patterns that are out there to the exclusion of others, and that's why our models are simplified and idealized. And one way I've been thinking about this is sort of to fit in with my Kantian view here is that I think this notion that just all of the pattern that we're picking up is just out there and we're just selecting from it is giving too much to the realist side, because I like to think of the patterns as they're represented in science as due to this interaction between the regularities that are there in nature and how we process the data and perform experiments and process the data. So one way to think about this is there are many different ways that you can process a neural data set. And if you average across time, you're going to create almost like bars in the data that wouldn't be there in the data themselves. And so I think of that as, in some sense, an ideal pattern, in some sense a real pattern, but it's due to this interaction between the scientist and nature.
Cool, thanks. I think that's everything I have there.
Okay.
Thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Mazviita. That was great. I enjoyed that very much, and I'm very sympathetic to this pluralistic approach. I have one easy question and one potentially harder question.
Mm-hmm.
So the easier question is, if you could say a little bit more about the Mach quote that you used.
Oh, yeah.
So the part you say, man has always been engaged in attempts to understand death by life and life by death.
Yeah.
And then you, in the paper, say that Mach foresaw why the information processing and intentional approach, would be a dominant force.
Yeah, it's a bit flippant. I'd say that.
Yeah, so I didn't necessarily see that. I was like, I could read that as seeing the dynamic approach as well. And so I was just hoping you could expand on that a little bit.
Right. So the idea is that at the heart of the information processing account is this analogy between living information processors and non-living ones, like computers. So computers, because they don't have any of the metabolizing substrates that brains have, they're much simpler, and they give you a sort of a framework from sort of abstracting away from all of that biological substrate and just thinking about things in terms of algorithms and functions, which so with the dynamical perspective, because you could say that the analogy that the approach is also there because these tools come in physics and we've used them to model non-living systems like rivers, and then we're sort of imposing that framework onto the brain. So I could see why you could also say that, like this, but it's not a very it's a contestable point. But I do think that because of how information processing and the computer analogy, because of the role that's played in neuroscience and cognitive science, and because of how it's unfed into functionalism and the philosophy of mind, it's caused problems for thinking about what minds is, that we think of minds as entirely abstractable away from living things. And like after I've had a drink, I will confess often that I'm a neo-Aristotelian, and I actually think that the connection between life and mind is quite a significant thing, and it's just lost in that functionalist way of doing things, which for good reason, to make sense of these systems, we characterize them in that way, but I don't think that helps you when you're doing the metaphysics of mind.
Mm-hmm. Great. So I should read the quote like literally, like the life and death comparison, living things, the brain, and the dead things. Okay, cool.
Right.
All right, thank you. And then what I think might be the tougher question is if you see the role of underdetermination going on in here. So, I was thinking particularly in terms of the cross-validation of models, right? Are they supposed to be equivalent? Or is the phenomena underdetermined? I was just really curious to hear, what we think about that.
Yeah, so I think the best example of cross-validation is in the Beer and Williams paper. So that is taking one toy cognitive system, so it's not anything like an animal. It's just this. He calls it a minimal cognitive agent. So it's basically a simulation creature, and then shows how that processes sensory information theory and makes a decision about where to move. And what they're doing in the paper is showing how you can take the data on this simulated agent and describe it in an information theoretic framework or a dynamical systems framework, and you can show how both of these approaches sort of can track the information flow. and that one isn't like the right way of describing the system. They both have their pluses and minuses. And so I'm seeing Eric now rather than Lewis. That's an issue.
Yeah, I saw Eric pop in for a second and then he disappeared.
Oh, yeah. So that is the best worked out example of cross-validation that I've come across. And in the motor cortex literature, where it's more been this debate about whether like the dynamical model can do everything that the information theoretic model can do, I'd say some of the results look to me like cross-validation, but there might be some cases where people, I mean, the point of the Michaels paper is to show that there's things that the dynamical model can explain that the information theoretic one can't. So it might not be fully cross-validated, but I'm sure there'll be responses to that from the other side. But the picture that I get as an outsider is that if you take neural data, you can just model it in these different ways, and so I like how Spear and Williams describe it as these different mathematical lenses through which to view the system. So your question is whether the theory is just underdetermined by the data. I don't exactly think of it as like the other way around from underdetermination, because we've got like the one system in nature that just affords these. I want to think about this different ways of describing it. Like, yeah.
I had a tough time of viewing. So I'm thinking of the figure you have where you talk about cross validation.
Yeah.
And then like the only thing that can be equivalent, I'm guessing that's what the arrow is indicating, an equivalence, were the models, but then anything else you add to it is going to be some sort of metaphysical commitment, right? And so I'm just wondering, is the phenomenon underdetermined such that we can't move past the cross-validation?
Yeah.
Does that help?
That's what I'm saying here.
Okay.
So if you ask the underdetermination question in that way, So right now at this stage of this stage in the neuroscience, it looks to me like it is underdetermined. Like there's just nothing in the phenomena that would settle those interpretative choices.
Yeah, and the models, as far as they're cross-validated, won't reveal anything about their being about information processing or their being about the phenomenon being a dynamic phenomenon, right?
Yeah, at this stage of research. Now, the thing is, this is subject to further inquiry. So, like with the Spear and Williams, a very trivially simple cognitive agency, like both models give you what you want. Both of the frameworks give you what you want. Could well be with, the brain up in 100 years' time, and people are only doing one kind of. Well, this is an option. This is an option for the Spears. Like if you say that, in 100 years' time, people find that only one choice of model is what's working for them, then you would say, well, then it's not underdetermined. It's not underdetermined. But the thing about perspectivism is it's betting that won't arise, because the more you do research, the more kinds of phenomena you uncover, and the more ways of modeling it start to become necessary, and you're not gonna end up with like one perspective just winning out against all others. So the point about like the future trajectory, I'm not saying like it's in principle not determinable, but it's the prediction of this perspective that it won't be settled once and for all.
Yeah. So one last thing, and then I'll step off the stage for a minute. It seems, so I try to be cautious about thinking where it's going to go in the future, where the research is going to go. But it seems strange to me that understanding the brain is going to be a shut up and calculate kind of approach, right? Because we want to understand it, and so we're going to want to put these theories, be them mechanistic or information processing or dynamical. But it sounds to me that if perspectivalism is going to be continuing for the foreseeable future, that sounds to me like a continuation of just shut up and calculate approach. That's how it came across to me. Could you?
Yeah, no. So I put that in as like a way of saying to the realist, you can't have your cake and eat it there. So this is part of the dilemma for the realist. But I think the Kantian approach is not that, because it's not putting a ban on interpretation in the way that the instrumentalist does. It's not saying you should never interpret your theories, but you should, when you're doing those interpretations, realize like what you as an inquirer are bringing to the table. Like you are making certain assumptions that make your interpretation possible, that are made in virtue of the kind of cognitive capacities that you have and limitations that you have. So your interpretation is never going to be like the one final truth theory of things.
Okay, great, thank you.
So I really, really enjoyed the talk. Also, timing for this was very serendipitous, since I'm actually doing a directed reading with two of my students on idealization and abstraction in science. And so we covered your talk here today. And so I wanted to give a sort of a shout out to my students, Elena and Vince, since my comments today really are a collaborative sort of effort there. So I really enjoyed this, since I'm very, very much on board with the ideas here. And I think in my own research, I have something very much in the back of my mind, the kind of idea you sort of talked about here. So it was nice to see someone sort of eloquently write it down. I do have a couple of worries here, which are worries that I struggle with myself, and I want to sort of come at them from two angles here. So the first worry that I have is the kind of worry that I think Jackie Sullivan raises. And this is the kind of worry here where, as you note, these two different perspectives often have different experimental protocols. Often the distinction between information process or intentional interpretations and dynamic interpretations can often draw the boundaries of where the system is in different sorts of ways. And so my worry is, if you go the neo-Kantian route, why can't someone suggest that what justification do we have for thinking that these are two different interpretations of the same thing, right? There's some assumption here, there's one system, be it the cortex or Eric or some cognitive phenomenon. Why don't we simply say, as neo-Kantians, we have different interpretations that carve the world in different ways, and so there are different phenomena. They might spatio-temporally overlap in various respects, but in some sense, they're not different perspectives on the same thing. They're simply characterizing different systems or different kinds of phenomenon tied to the various perspectives. It seems to suggest they're different perspectives, learning different things about the same complex system seems to require metaphysical commitments that go beyond what's suggested by the kind of perspectivalism. So are you worried about an idealist implication here, that in some sense the path of inquiry or the perspective sort of creates the system under discovery? In part, yes. So I have two worries. One is the stronger view, yes. And the second is, even if we think that the stronger view isn't the biggest worry, we still have sort of the sort of worries that I think Jackie Sullivan brought up, which is that even if there is one system, why assume that what looks like cross-validation might be an artifact of how we've set up our experiments to look that way? Yeah, so it might well be that the kind of cross-validation that you get here. Yeah, so this could be a real worry. So with the Beer and Williams cross-validation example, which I sort of shows that really nicely, but it's a trivially simple thing where
every artificial neuron in the system gets into the model. So there's no question about selecting what parts of the system make it into the model. And here with with how you carve up something like the motor cortex, you might well sort of look at anatomically different parts of it depending on what framework you're coming from. So for my kind of perspectival realism, I'm not so worried about the cross-validation not happening. For someone like Michaela Massamy, who wants this more robust notion of perspectival truth, that is a problem for her. So if I stick with this P3, which is just context-dependent truth, then I don't need that cross-validation, but for the P4, you do. So it might well be that, it might turn out that you don't get that every time. But think importing sort of Jackie Sullivan's worry, like, are we really dealing with something consistent that we can call memory, or is it just memory for this lab and memory for that lab and memory for that lab? Yeah, that, I mean, to the extent that there needs to be some kind of way of sort of integrating results across different areas of research, that is sort of pragmatic. Yeah, that is something that you might worry about. Say, I mean, it's already something that people worry about in neuroscience, that there's so much data being produced with different ways of getting it, and how do we know what we're doing? So one thing that you could say is actually having perspectives might help you. So because we're generating all this data, and there's like maybe some kinds of idiosyncrasies in how they're processed and modeled. But if people like became more self-conscious about their perspectivism, they could like carve up communities like more in a bit more rigorous way. You say, well, if you're in the dynamicist camp, then you're going to have to use this kind of anatomical parcellation, and you're just going to have to do things this way, and you might actually get more of the fruitful interlab crosstalk that avoids the Sullivan type worries than if you were sort of less self-conscious about your perspectivism and just sort of pick and chose models in a more arbitrary way. So that's one thing you could say. Actually, having perspectivism in place, like within a perspective, things could be quite regimented.
Awesome. So that actually relates to my second question, which is, as you noted, you tend to want to adopt P3 over P4 to not have to deal with that. So I want to my second question here is a worry from the exact opposite direction. So it seems like we have cases where we could adopt this kind of perspectival pluralism, but we don't think we ought to, right? So the case I have in mind here is, suppose we are studying a system in evolutionary biology, and we have some models that track causal dynamics and work with finite population sizes, but we also have optimality models, which idealize those things and work with infinite population sizes. Now, here's my worry, is that we don't think, or at least I think a lot of people think what we shouldn't say is we say, okay, the optimality model works with infinite population sizes. Are population sizes infinite or finite? What we don't say is, well, if you're in the optimality perspective, they're really infinite. And if you're working in, another modeling perspective, they're really finite. What we seem to want to say is that, no, when we say they're infinite in the optimality case, that's an idealization. But if here it seems that the reason for wanting to assume it's an idealization is because it's not, in some respect, cross-validated with what the other accounts say. So if we remove that, do we simply just shrug and say, are populations finite or not? And we go, well, depends on one's perspective here. It seems there's a worry with going down that route of, if we want to treat some things as an idealization, and in this case we assume that it's an idealization, why can't we say the same thing when we say, well, just as infinite population sizes ought to be treated as an idealization, so should intentional characterizations, where the intentionality is an idealization, but gets the accounts right. So
yeah. So I would sort of like draw a distinction here between sort of idealizations and like simplifications of sort of, but that are consistent with the empirical facts. So yeah, even within the optimality perspective, the positing of an infinite population is not consistent with the empirical facts, and that within that perspective, you're still beholden to the empirical facts. Right. Whereas I think of the coding as not an idealization in the sense that you're saying something literally and obviously false of the brain, but it's a way of interpreting the brain, which I think is an abstraction, but one that is not, like I said, not contrary to the empirical findings, because if you take all that neural data and assume you can parcel it off in terms of signal, which is the peak tuning, and then all the rest is noise, then that's a way of processing the data that's not inconsistent with the data, but it's, so I don't take that as an idealization.
Yeah, okay, good. That helps a lot. I think that's it. The only last thing I want to mention very briefly is going sort of full hog the other direction here. This is really crazy. Why? So, again, the assumption here is that we have our different simplifying perspectives on one complex system. Again, if one goes neo-Kantian, why doesn't one take the more extreme route of the kind that we see in sort of Nancy Cartwright's The Dappled World or Dupre's The Disorder of Things, and say that the lesson isn't that they're simplifications of one coherent complex system. The lesson is simply that reality is not necessarily metaphysically coherent in some respect. And so what we have are not various simplifications. They're in some sense true, it's just we shouldn't expect the world to be relevantly coherent, because that seems similarly to be compatible with the kind of perspectival neo-Kantian view you suggested, but it doesn't seem to be the direction you want to go.
Yeah. I hadn't thought about that. So you're saying if you take that view, you're saying that the motor cortex is inherently inconsistent because in itself it is both an information processor and a dynamical system, and those two things are
right. So I mean, I'm not so comfortable going down that route for the metaphysical incoherence, but it certainly seems in the logical space a viable account that fits with this kind of story that you're telling as well.
Yeah, I mean, why I don't like that view, it's because it does seem to be, and I don't know if this is sort of the Prey and Nancy's view really, but if you do sort of take that lesson from them and say motor cortex is both of those things at once in this inherently inconsistent way, it's sort of taking the scientific model too literally, and it's just saying that that model has got the literal truth of one aspect of the brain which sort of corresponds with something in there, and I'm trying to get away from that correspondence picture in itself, which I'm saying that the models and perspectives that we arrive at come about from this interaction with the brain, but it doesn't mean that you can literally find that model in the brain, which seems to be what that view is saying.
Awesome. So that covers all my questions and comments. That was great. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a small question indeed. Can you please come back to this? Well, actually go forward until the slide where you make a comparison between the two perspectives. Now, perhaps it's back.
Okay.
Yeah, because well,
that one, is it that one?
Yeah. That one, yes, thank you. Now, I was wondering, I usually work on neuroscientific literature, mainly coming from neuroimaging with fMRI and so on. And of course, when we come to motor cortex, I realized that motor cortex has been studied thoroughly by using electrodes since David Ferrier. But I was wondering if the intentional perspective also applies as a meso or macro scale, that is with those brain structures, brain regions, whatever, however you call them, that are the basic building blocks, so to speak, of the ontology in cognitive neuroscience based on fMRI data. I mean, is that the same thing, perhaps in a more phrenological flavor? Can you extend the framework of the intentional perspective to include that thing too, or there are important differences?
Yeah, so how I think about the intentional perspective, there are specific hypotheses in there about what particular brain areas are coding, so what the and what information is processed. So I don't know the fMRI too much on this, but when it gets to sort of fine-grained things where, say, people are trying to do this with MVPA, so arguing that those kinds of analysis tells you what's represented in particular brain areas. You could say that, yeah, that's in this ballpark. Of course, that's very controversial because people are saying, no, you can't infer from MVPA decoding to neural representations. But I think this intentional perspective has been the motivation for trying to make those connections with fMRI to representations, because you want to be able to link in with our specific theories about neural coding and everything. You want to say, well, what are the representations in there, and how do they change as you go along the processing stream?
Yeah, no, it's a nice end, the one from the connection between area to neuron via MVPA for several reasons. But I was thinking about bold claims and arguably very wrong claims like Broca's area represents language processing, or amygdala represents fear processing, or threat-related stimuli processing. Would you say that represent sounds weird here? Would you say that this is perhaps the same perspective that you use when you talk about single neuron physiology? Just say there are perhaps some nested hierarchical levels.
Yeah. So often the those kinds of broad brush claims that you see in fMRI, I think that's the relevant bit of the relevant origin theory is often in cognitive science, where or if you like, boxology, where you have a cognitive hierarchy that, to have working memory, you need this kind of processing in a buffer, and then it goes up to, and those kinds of things, and then you can, and it's very much an information processing perspective, but you're mapping, if you like, psychological constructs onto fMRI data. So I would say it's broadly speaking within that intentional perspective, but it's the theories that I've been looking at specifically here, and my background being in the visual cortex, there's just attempting to be much more fine-grained about the application of information theory, like getting precise measurements about how much information one neuron could be transmitting.
Yeah, I see. Okay, I just thank you for the talk. Just a small. I'm not an expert on motor cortex, so I'm a curiosity more than a question. And the curiosity is if you say something more about the difference between intentional versus causal relation between, and why these labels. So maybe you say something at the end of page 12 when you say that according to the intentional perspectives, brain states are not merely directed to, but persisting memory are absent also from external stimulants. And I'm a bit familiar with the debate in semantic theory, and one of the crucial difference between causality and intentionality is that when the relation is intentional as opposed to causal, there's the possibility of misrepresentations.
Yeah.
And is there any kinds of analogy with motor representation? Is there any possibility of misrepresentations that justify this? So that
So that's one thing. I was, it's a bit too quick in that passage there, and I didn't want to go into it too much. But this is what I mean. I don't know whether you want to say from the brain's perspective there's really misrepresentation, but I think it's really significant that these things where you in brain-computer interface experiments, you can perturb the relationship between the neural firing and the movement, and how the brain tries to compensate for that or adapt to it. You could interpret the brain as saying, oh, I'm misrepresenting something, I need to be correct. And so that intentional language is very natural there. And I don't think that is captured by just talking all the time about causation. So I think it's the fact, so I think there is a relevant sense of some mappings between neural firing and movement being the correct ones when the system is working normally, and other ones being incorrect because they don't lead to the intended movement, and the brain itself correcting for those. That's what makes the intentional natural.
I had a small question. Can you hear me still?
Yeah. Perfect.
Great. This was more of a, so it kind of relates to Fabrizio's point very vaguely, but it's more of a terminological thing. So at one point in the paper, you described functionalism as a philosophical theory of mind-body relationship which presupposes internal representations. And I'm not quite sure that's right.
Okay.
I feel that functionalism's a bit broader than that.
Right.
Because you could be a non-representationalist, functionalist, or computationalist even possibly.
Okay. Yeah. So which views are you thinking of?
Well, there's two different things. On the one hand, I feel there's views like Gualtiero Piccinini's non-representational computationalist kind of view.
Okay.
But more generally, I tend to think of functionalism as just a very general claim about what how to describe systems or how to do cognitive science or something. And one kind of function you could have would be to represent something. But there are other kinds of functions you could ascribe to something. But maybe you had a narrower sense of functionalism.
Yeah, I think you're probably. I think you're right there. I mean, especially if you're talking about representations in some kind of full-blown semantic sense, which probably I wasn't there. But yeah.
Okay, cool. I mean, it was a very minor point.
Yeah,
it wasn't really
I think that's right.
Okay.
Well, if nobody else, then perhaps I can make another question that just came to my mind.
I have a quick follow-up, or not follow-up, but question. So I was kind of curious if you could say more about why the brain is called Heraclitean, and that being tied to perspectivalism. It seems a bit of a tension in my view, because it seems like there's a commitment to what the brain is like when you call it Heraclitean. And to me, I'm just so biased that I'm like, that sounds dynamical, right off the bat. But then that doesn't seem to go along with the kind of pluralistic perspectival.
Yeah, right. So there's that section in the paper where I'm taking the Dreyfus-Haugland point and saying that it's not, calling the brain Heraclitean doesn't just give you their view for free, because but anyway, so what I mean by saying that the brain is Heraclitean is just that it's always changing in order to see what it is. And then I'm saying that way of being a thing is not fully capturable in any one perspective. So I do try and argue that even the dynamical perspective, because of the simplifications that it has to introduce, is not going to capture everything about the Heraclitean brain. And I also think that and then I think that it's important that there are these phenomena that are naturally described as senses that are also not captured by the dynamical perspective, but they are just there even in that Heraclitean brain. So by Heraclitean, I don't mean the same thing as dynamical systems, low dimension, especially not low dimensional linear dynamical.
Right, right. One quick follow-up. So it seems that you're making a metaphysical claim about what the brain is like. It's continuously changing.
Yeah.
And it seems that maybe a more cautious approach would be to make it an epistemic claim. To us, it appears constantly changing and complex. That might be easier to mesh with perspectivalism.
Yeah. So I want to be bold on this because I think there's enough just basic biology to tell us that if you take all of the details literally as important, then it is always, that's just what cells do. So it's not even coming from neuroscience, it's just a basic fact of biology. So you can just take that for granted, and then the assumption has been in computational neuroscience that all of that biology doesn't matter. And I'm saying, well, what if it does? But we can't study it as neuroscience, unless, most of the time. So why do I want to make a metaphysical claim? I mean, it's sort of that's the premise for the Kantian conclusion, is that there are things there that we, in some sense, can know are there, but can't really know about. So not exactly, because I'm saying something about noumenal brains. So, throwing that in there. But
was that a pun? Things that we can't know about? Sorry, that was terrible.
I don't know. But so that's this. Yeah, this is the view that I'm defending here. But it may seem a tension that I'm saying that there are views taken sort of non-perspectively that then influences metaphysical view. But I mean, one thing about this biological claim is that it's very robustly through many different perspectives, like many different ways you might want to study biology. It just seems, it's the kind of thing that's always changing. So it's not a view that's tied to any one particular biological perspective. I think they would all have to acknowledge it, and to some extent. And in neuroscience, I mean, it comes up with Marder's research, but also saw a talk recently about sort of, the synapses, and that they're obviously important in information processing, and they're just constantly churning over, and the substrate of memory is constantly turning over, and it's weird that we have memories lasting almost our whole lifetime. The actual substrate of them is always changing.
Yes.
Right, great, thank you.
May I jump in? Sorry. As far as I am very sympathetic, I very much like the metaphor of Heraclitean brain. It stresses something important, but then you come to think that perhaps there is something trivial in claiming that the brain is Heraclitean, because as you made us realize, everything is Heraclitean, arguably, especially in the life science, and more so, there is an important sense in which the neuron is the neural system, the brain is less Heraclitean than other organs, because we know that we only have a fixed number of neurons. There is very neurogenesis in very few areas, and while there are functional rearrangements even in the adulthood, you know that after the critical period the neuroanatomy is more or less stable, so to speak. It's not completely stable, but as a comparative claim, perhaps we could stress that the brain, you do that, but perhaps it's not so explicit that the brain, yeah, it is Heraclitean, but not as much as, say, the liver or the stomach or the lungs.
Yeah,
whatever.
actually, I wouldn't know from the different, or comparing the different organs, like whether there's too much. I mean, people were surprised by that there's any neurogenesis, because it used to be assumed that there was none at all. But I mean, on the gross structural anatomy, yeah, the neurons themselves, lots of them, they stay alive throughout your lifetime. But then at the level of synapses and wiring, there's lots of change and lots of turnover. And then with glial cells, that I haven't talked about, this is one thing that gets ignored with the intentional perspective, because you're just looking at the spiking information. But there's all that other stuff in the glial support, which could be changing a lot. And yeah, so I don't know. So if you don't go in with the assumption that certain kinds of neural structures and processing are the ones relevant for information, I don't know if it's, so I wouldn't necessarily think it's true to say that it's less powerful than other structures.
Okay. Is there any further question, either from the attendees or from the discussants?
I've got something. I think that's okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm actually very much on board with you in that I think this is an issue of sort of complexity of a system that we can't fully conceptualize, and we have these perspectives with different simplifications. So while I agree with you, there is an option here that I thought was really interesting that you sort of touch on a little bit when you talk a bit about the mathematical pluralism case, where I'm wondering where you at the end when you talk about the use of mathematics to characterize the neural processes, you sort of give two options, and I'm wondering if there's a kind of middle ground. So one of the options is that it's just sort of pure formalism, right? We're sort of just moving things around that's sort of not interpreted. And the other is that it's a kind of, the other option is it's a kind of sort of almost Platonic kind of picking out abstract, right? Now I'm wondering if there's a middle ground here where it isn't, we aren't left, mathematics isn't sort of necessarily picking out objects in the Platonic realm, so to speak.
Right.
It is a description of the world.
Right.
And it is an interpretation of the world, a mathematical one. So it's not that it's uninterpreted, it's simply that, so what this semantics is above my pay grade. I don't know how to make sense of it. But it might be one that just simply doesn't fit well with natural language. And so what I'm wondering here is, why couldn't one, so my intuitions don't go this way, but it strikes me that one could argue that, well, the lesson here isn't that the system is so complex that we need these simplified accounts. The lesson is simply that natural language is ill-equipped to characterize these things entirely. But the right kind of representational framework is when we can understand, we can conceptualize and understand the mathematical concepts and ideas here. And so the right kind of framework can, in principle, fully account for it. It's just the assumption that the interpretations are tied to natural language might be the mistake. So if we go back to sort of early natural language philosophers, right, the claim here is that what we need is a different language, one that can do the work. But if you have the kind of view that we see with something like P4 as opposed to P3, then the lesson here is that, well, the right kind of mathematical formalism might lead us to something that isn't necessarily a mathematical pluralism. We might be able to translate that, into which case we're left with something a bit more like the ontic structural realism, which isn't quite necessarily that it's picking out abstracta, and isn't quite necessarily the kind of strict noumenal account. And it's something that sort of you don't really consider, and I was curious to get your thoughts on that.
I didn't consider that. So one thing I think about the views that I end up with right there at the end is that that I don't think, so as I said, neither of them are like the the final blueprint of the brain or anything like that. Like the book that God wrote for the brain. That's ruled out because these are mathematical constructs that human scientists have made that like find order. One thing that I've been looking at in another paper is use of deep networks in neuroscience, because what they do is if you take, say, one visual cortex neuron and you try and get a function that describes its response properties, the one that human scientists come up with have a linear core and then some nonlinear add-ons, but to a human mind, it's a sensible equation. You can interpret it. But if you let a deep network AI find the function that describes neural responses, that function is there embedded in the network, and you might assume, you would want to say that it's found this horribly complex nonlinear function that is what the neuron computes, except that no human, at least presently, can understand it. So you might want to say that God wrote the language of neuroscience in the kind of equations described in those models. But, yeah, that are there embedded in those models, but we can't figure them out.
Right.
I don't know if that answers your question. But
It answers it in as much as I'm not quite sure what to say about that either. But yeah, that's. Thank you.